It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP Laura Farris, Labour MP Rosie Duffield, editor of Reaction and Times columnist Ian Martin, and The Guardian's Raphael Baer. Today, as more flee the fighting in Ukraine, questions about Britain's policy on refugees. The Home Secretary says rules could be eased further, but there's confusion about what that means.
The stories of what's actually happening on the ground contradict what the Home Office say. They've got to sort this out. A simple route to sanctuary.
We are a very, very generous country. What we want, though, is control, and we want to be able to have checks.
The government is also pushing through new sanctions rules, but do they go far enough? Also today.
Hi. How are you all?
With oil and gas prices soaring amid the crisis, will the Chancellor have to offer more support to help with the cost of living? And is the Ukraine crisis demonstrating the value of global Britain? Well, with the Ukraine crisis still dominating the headlines, no surprise really, we are seeing more harrowing pictures and footage of people fleeing the violence. You can see on the front page of lots of the newspapers, The Sun and The Mirror here, showing people, as they say, running for their lives. And of course, the journalists out there covering all of this are witnessing people really trying to flee and actually under fire quite a lot of the time there. There's also questions, of course, too, about how much this country is doing to help those fleeing Ukraine. We know that more than 1 million have left. And there has been some confusion this morning about all of this. There are two schemes that we know about. One is Ukrainians who have links with people here in Britain. They can apply to come over. There's also a sponsorship route. There was some talk today about another way that the government might help people. But that now has been, we've been told that actually everything's under consideration, but there's nothing specific on the table. Good question, really, for you, Laura. Do you know what's going on with the refugee help for refugees?
Well, this is a situation in Parliament, I was just saying beforehand, where things are changing day by day. Every single day there's a new statement by a minister on whether it's refugees or sanctions or military aid. So it is true, it's a moving picture. I think one of the things that we have seen on refugees, because I think there's an implied criticism for me there, is that we have seen that when the Home Office sort of dedicates all its resources, I think the Home Secretary calls it surge staffing, which is what's happening now, they can turn it around very fast. And we saw that in Afghanistan in the summer where they were processing visas very fast. I mean, I've been working with two constituents, who have relatives seeking to come over as refugees. We had their visas approved this morning. They were like in my inbox as I was coming to this. So I think we know that...
You would say it's happening quite quickly.
I think it is. I know that there have been 13,000 applications to the Home Office, and the test will be how quickly they are turned around.
Now, the idea that we have a generous scheme, that's what the Prime Minister says, Rosie. Do you think he's right?
Well, someone like me is bound to criticise the scheme because I just want as little paperwork and as little bureaucracy in the way of people getting to safety. No visas at all? I think at the moment we have to treat this as an absolute emergency crisis, and that's what it is. And we need to just let people through. Of course, we've got to do checks, but if they get in the way of people fleeing in a desperate situation from a war zone, let's shelve that for now. It's very unlikely they're going to be horrible criminals. These are people who are just trying to survive at the moment.
And Ian, what do you think about all of this? I mean, the government seems to be saying you need to have security checks at the very least.
I find it incredible and I think it's shaming to our country, actually. I think I can see why the Prime Minister is using the word control, an echo there of the Brexit campaign, but I think it's ridiculous. Just minimum amount of paperwork. And we're living in a situation where 650,000 people at least, maybe it'll be 1 million soon, have gone through Poland. There shouldn't be form filling prioritised. It should be a very, very simple check at the border, which is if someone is a Ukrainian citizen and they want to come to Britain and they want to get out and shelter for 12 to 36 months, they should be waved through. And I think it is, I don't know why the government, having been ahead of the curve in warning about the invasion of Ukraine, which all credit to the Ministry of Defence and to MI6, who have been warning for months about this. Why were they not prepared with a scheme in the way that the Poles and the EU seem to be? It is baffling.
Raphael, do you agree with that, or do you think, as the Prime Minister says, that actually having checks, security checks, is something that we need to do? There has to be some control, he says.
Well, on that latter point, I point out that neighbouring countries to Ukraine, particularly Moldova, which is a small and very poor country, Poland also, not only are they not sort of conducting rigorous security checks, so they're accepting, in some cases, sort of out-of-date old documents, precisely for the reasons that Ian just said. They accept that these people are fleeing the most horrendous conflicts we've seen on the European continent for over half a century. So those are countries that are quite poorly set up in terms of the infrastructure to deal with the influx they're going to have, and the UK should be in better shape. I would just add one other thing on this, which is that you have to remember this is also in the political context of the Nationalities and Borders Bill, which is sort of pointing, it was conceived and is pointing in an entirely different direction. And, part of that bill essentially would criminalise the process of people coming to the UK seeking asylum, refugees, if the method by which they did it wasn't some orthodox channel. So if these people are sort of fleeing for their lives and they somehow get to the UK, not just going through the official channels, just by whatever means they can, which is historically what a lot of refugees have done, if this law, if this bill becomes law, that becomes a criminal offence for them, which is actually a contravention of UN human rights law anyway. So the government's tied itself into a bit of a knot in here, because its whole immigration and asylum policy was facing one way, and now it's basically got a moral imperative demanding it move in another direction, and the Home Office just isn't equipped to make that kind of pivot.
Laura, it does feel as if the government has been slightly caught on the hop, if you like. As you say, things are changing all the time, but it was our country, along with the Americans, warning that this was going to happen.
Well, can I just come back very briefly on what Raphael was saying? The idea that the government doesn't open the doors to refugees isn't true. The offer that was made to Hong Kongers, the BNO passport holders, 3 million were given the right of sanctuary when the Chinese crackdown began in Hong Kong about 18 months ago. In Afghanistan, the airlift was the biggest UK military sort of evacuation exercise since Dunkirk, and those people, a number of whom live in my constituency and have now kids in the local schools, were welcomed. So I think it is wrong to conflate it with the Nationality and Borders Bill. The Prime Minister has been absolutely clear that we are going to be making a huge... for example, both the schemes that you described, Vicki, are without any cap on numbers, and the visas, of course, are free of charge. I do take the point about security checks, just to give the government's counterpoint. It is believed that some of the Russian invading forces are at risk of masquerading as Ukrainians in order to possibly infiltrate countries, so some security check is required. But I think the point in which all of us agree is that these, of course, shouldn't take time, and we do expect to see this accelerated.
And lots of people are saying that actually the security checks could be done pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Are you saying that shouldn't happen?
No, I think we do need that basic level. Obviously, Laura had a point there about people infiltrating, but, I'm with Raphael on this, and Ian, we really need to react as though it is an absolute emergency. And prosecuting people, again, the Nationality and Borders Bill is coming up. We're going to be fighting that for how they get here when they are just trying to literally stay alive and give their children somewhere safe to be is horrible, I think.
Ian, what about Edward Lee, the MP from Lincolnshire, who said last week that actually he suggested that there would be people in this country who feel we've done our bit. They were his quotes. He said he was misinterpreted, but we have done our bit on immigration from Eastern Europe, and that actually there would be extreme pressure put on jobs and housing, and actually that the people here wouldn't accept a no limits, system.
I just think it's completely
You don't
ludicrous.
think that's where the British people are?
I think it's completely ludicrous. Well, if they are, isn't that what political leadership is about? I don't honestly believe, I don't think it is a question of opinion polling, but I think if you ask people now who are all glued to watching the coverage on the BBC and elsewhere of this humanitarian disaster, which is only going to get worse in the next few weeks, of course there are stresses and strains, and we'll come to talk, I'm sure, later on about energy and what this is going to do to the economy. We're moving into a completely different era. So I just think that kind of thinking, I voted for Brexit in the referendum, but that kind of Brexit era assumption and thinking and way of thinking about immigration and humanitarian rights and Europe, the wider sort of question of European solidarity, I just think is hopelessly out of date. There might be some voters who think that, but they're wrong morally.
Let's just have a look at the reason why there is so much pressure on the government. We've got some footage here, which is from Ukraine, and showing how people are still trying to get out. This is people trying to get out from Irpin. It's about 12 miles northwest of Kiev, near an airfield. And as you can see here very, very clearly, they are coming under fire in some cases, as just running there. And terrible stories. One yesterday of a family who were walking along and then they were just shelled, and a family, two of the children died there. So that is why there's so much pressure on governments around the world. And Raphael, I suppose part of the point here is that those countries on the border are letting people in, and they're letting people in without any checks.
And as I say, they're not necessarily tremendously well equipped in terms of infrastructure. You also have to remember that just by the nature of what's caused this crisis, it's a war, and a lot of men of fighting age are going to stay in Ukraine and fight. And so you have a lot of women and children going to make up the majority of people crossing those borders. And so the idea, the idea is possible, I suppose, that there could be some Russian infiltration, people masquerading, spies somehow sneaking all the way into the UK. But frankly, well, first of all, 2 points on that. I think if Russians wanted to infiltrate the UK, there's plenty of ways they can do that. And second of all, if we're looking at nefarious Russian influence in the UK that will somehow support Vladimir Putin's war aims, again, there's a whole apparatus of Russian influence through the economy, through business, through political donations that's been going on for years. And the idea that you would basically stop refugees at the border, women and children, because they might actually be secretly working for the FSB, it's notionally true, but it's just got a slightly cynical whiff of cruelty, even the allegations, as far as I'm concerned.
OK, well, let's look at what's going on in the House of Commons today, related to all of this, of course, and that's the issue of sanctions, because MPs are going to vote through the economic crime bill. That's the plan. They're rushing it through Parliament in a bid to clamp down on Russian money in the UK. But there are quite a lot of amendments to all of this. And Raphael, I'm going to ask you to explain. Actually, first of all, let's have a look at The Independent, actually. This is an article which gets to the point, I guess, where it says Russian oligarchs still have a get out of London free card under new laws. And that's why they're hoping to change it. So the plan today, Raphael, lots of amendments going down about trying to really toughen up this legislation, I guess.
Yeah, so the big picture here is that this legislation has been planned for years. I think it goes back to about 2016. It was shelved at the beginning of this year. It's not entirely clear why. It's suddenly been brought back because there is so much pressure to clamp down essentially on oligarch ill-gotten gains. And one of the main ways they do that is by sinking a lot of hot capital into particularly the London and South East property market. It's one way. If you own a mansion in Hyde Park, in Mayfair, it's worth a lot of money and it's going to stay there and it's pretty safe, in terms of British law, but that could basically be stolen money. And so you need to find some legal mechanism to find out who really owns those assets. And once you've uncovered who that is, then you can maybe start taking action against them under the sanctions. Now, the thing is, if in that law, as currently drafted, and this is what the amendments are really arguing about, you also have some transitional periods, both between when the law is passed and when it comes into effect, and how long there is before you actually have to the legal requirement is there to declare who is the real owner of these properties, who is the real person behind some shell company registered in the British Virgin Islands through which all this money is moving. You're basically giving the bad guys a head start, is the argument. You're saying, look, I'm going to raid you, but I'm going to raid you next Thursday. So if you've got anything, stolen goods, whatever, feel free to move it between now and then. And the opposition is saying, well, how about we don't give them that amount of time? How about we just tighten it right up and go after it right now? And that's broadly, as I understand it, the argument that's going on through the amendments now, because the opposition support the thrust of the bill. And
Laura, it does feel to lots of people as if this, again, should have been done a bit quicker. And there is that problem there, isn't it? If you're going to give people 18 months to register, there is the risk that assets are moved out of the country.
Oh, well, the government has backed an amendment today that's reducing that to six months.
Labour does want to go a bit further on that.
Look, I think it's true that over the last decades, going back to the 90s, we have completely failed to require the disclosure of beneficial ownership on properties, actually other asset classes as well, in this country. So this bill goes some way to correct that. And the difference, I think, between the Conservative Party, which is now putting a 6-month time limit, and the Labour Party, which is asking for basically a 1-month time limit, so it's about 5 months. I think one of the issues for that is that we're already operating pretty close to the borderline of what is lawful, because not every single person who owns a property in London through a shell company is a Russian oligarch. And many of them will be doing it lawfully, so they have got to have some rights to get their affairs in order. But the other point I would just make about this, because I've had a number of emails about sanctions, is that somewhere I think that's sort of what's being implied is that if we identify that the owner of a mansion in Belgravia is a Russian oligarch, he will be so sort of antagonised that he will gang up with the other oligarchs and approach Putin and persuade him to change course. There's a lot of hypothetical in there. I think, in fact, the most powerful thing the international community has done, including Great Britain and the United Kingdom, is isolate the Russian economy, is exclude it from access to the central reserves, exclude it from the SWIFT banking system, collapse the ruble, which has now only been shored up in a desperate way by the Russian central bank hiking interest rates, tipping the Russian economy into a recession which will impact on their ability to fund the war effort and will entrench public discontent. So I think in terms of the direct measures that have been taken in the last 10 days to really tackle the Russian economy and to create extreme pain in Moscow, we've been effective in doing that, notwithstanding the measures that are coming through in the economic crime bill today on oligarchs.
Rosie, on oligarchs in particular, I mean, the government has a point. They have led the way, you could argue, in some of the terms of the economic sanctions. I mean, oligarchs, it's a great headline, isn't it? You know, seizing a yacht, obviously. Is that really going to be the thing that harms the Russian economy and affects Putin?
No, obviously Laura had some really good points. We've done the SWIFT banking thing. We're not hoping not to sort of deal with Russia in the way that we have been. But I think if you're a person at home who's going to be faced with these sanctions putting prices up and the cost of living going up, or if you're an ordinary Russian, it sticks in the craw somewhat that, you know, you might have a fully staffed home in Westminster or Belgravia, you know, chefs and all. We all know that they're there. They've got priceless works of art on the wall and they visit possibly one day a year. That's morally disgusting, and we do need to cut down on those people. Perhaps the homeless could move in to some of those properties.
You're suggesting seizing their properties?
Absolutely, and this amendment, which I hope is chosen, will stop that being 6 months and make it 28 days. We need to get this done as soon as is legally possible.
Does that sound like something that you would go along with? I mean, there has to be proof, doesn't there? This is the point.
Obviously, yeah.
There has to be proof and there has to be a legal mechanism. I think Rosie and I are arguing around the fringes really on this. I mean, the point is that I think that across Parliament there is agreement that there should be a more muscular approach to the oligarchs. But as I say, I think linking it back to how, if at all, it will change the course of action in Ukraine is actually far less clear.
And Ian, on all of that, I mean, lots of people saying that there are Russians who have sanctions against them by the US, by the EU, but actually they're not facing sanctions here. And the government is being criticised for that. Do you think it matters?
They deserve it. I mean, I agree on one level. I think the stuff that's been done by the central banks is phenomenal. People talk a lot about the collapse of the West, but actually the ECB, the EU, UK Treasury, what the Bank of England did in concert with the Fed last week, I think was almost underreported. It was an enormous move in the financial global system and has been very effective, though we're now probably going to pay the price on energy, which we'll come to later, I'm sure. But I'm seriously concerned about this bill, partly because I've asked MPs this morning and texted around and can't find anyone who's read it. It's been done at such enormous speed. I think we've had, don't want to go back into COVID, but we've had a lesson in the last few years on what happens if the major parties all broadly agree on the direction of legislation and it's pushed through in a hurry. There's potential danger on miscarriage of justice, or all manner of things could go wrong. Now, the UK Whitehall has a real problem here. I'm not criticising the individual law officers, but we have in the UK very limited capacity on this sort of stuff. The US has a sanctions department, cycles in lawyers in and out from private business through it. They have a lot of experience. The UK is trying to do this at speed with everyone shouting that something must be done. And I would just flag up that there are dangers there. David Davis has an amendment or suggesting a new clause, which sounds quite sensible to me, which is essentially asset freezes, which allows people to still benefit from the asset, but doesn't essentially sequester it or remove it straight away. So I would just advise just a little bit of caution when the House of Commons has got its sort of moral, has got its moral gander up.
Rosie, that is fair enough, isn't it? I mean, there is no one's going to have much sympathy for oligarchs. They're not going to be a group of people that everyone's going to feel sorry for. But you can't just, because someone's a wealthy Russian, seize their mansion.
Absolutely not just because they're a wealthy Russian, but if we can see that there are links that shouldn't be there.
But it's the burden of proof, isn't it? There are hurdles you need to get over.
Yeah, absolutely. But let's face it, we know a lot of this stuff anyway. And, you know, there are people who've got... Carol Cadwallader, for example, has been exposing some of these links for a very long time. So I think if people know about them, they have to be acted on. But yes, of course, we can't just rush things through emotionally without sort of due legal paperwork and everything and checks.
I mean,
go on, sorry.
I was just going to say briefly, some of this is actually a corrective to stuff that has, for example, the unexplained wealth order legislation, which has existed for some time and has only had very, very limited success. I mean, in fact, no Russian has ever been the subject of an unexplained wealth order. The first person was in 2018 and was the Azerbaijani wife who went on the memorable shopping spree in Harrods where she spent £16 million and her husband was languishing in jail. And even then, she challenged it all the way to the Supreme Court, ultimately unsuccessfully, but it took years to get there. So part of today's legislation is about making those more effective and quicker to bite.
OK, and Raphael, do you agree with that? I mean, some people do think that resources is a problem here, whether it's the National Crime Agency or whether it is government lawyers, really.
Yeah, I think that is actually the key to it. I mean, actually, in terms of serious fraud, just domestic fraud, actually, UK prosecutions don't have a great record. In terms of persuading juries in complex fraud trials. There is, I think Ian made a very good point just about the sort of organisational, professional capacity to take on these incredibly complex, sometimes financial structures and prove wrongdoing in a way that is satisfactory to a British legal standard. But of course, that points you to a wider issue here, which is how deep into sort of the British financial political ecosystem corrupt Russian money, dating all the way back to the Yeltsin era and the sort of creation of the oligarchy that became the foundation of the modern Russian state, how deep those roots go. And so you can't obviously just in sort of, in a couple of weeks, write a law and say, OK, we're sorry that we basically turned a blind eye to huge amounts of larceny, kleptocracy, channeling its ill-gotten gains into our capital city and through our financial system. Now that's all going to stop. Of course, it's not all going to stop overnight. It's not all going to stop as a result of one law. But if there is, we can now express the political will and the recognition, which I'm getting a sense of that was actually a terrible mistake and a geostrategic error to have turned a blind eye to that. It's a good thing that we can now actually basically acknowledge that, I think.
And Ian, that is the point, isn't it, that this is not new, this Russian wealth coming into this country. It's been going on for decades.
It has been going on for
under different governments as well.
It has, yeah. And it's, you're now in a situation where London is divided in terms of the sort of lobbying and PR world and legal firms world, top legal firms, between those who took a principled decision at some point in the last decade or so that they would not take clients from Russia, and those who calculated that it was worth the risk because there was so much money around. I'm not passing a moral judgment on it, but it is fascinating to watch people scramble. There's a huge readjustment happening, and essentially what the West is doing is cutting Russia and Russian money off from the global financial system, and there's going to be a lot of collateral damage in wealthy London.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the collateral damage, as you put it, but also wider than Russians living here. The cost of living generally, lots of people warning about, yes, sanctions against Russia, but actually the impact that's going to have on all of us around the world. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has been talking about an idea that they have about banning Russian exports. Here's what he had to say.
We are now in very active discussions with our European partners about banning the import of Russian oil to our countries, while, of course, at the same time maintaining a steady global supply of oil.
So the US Secretary of State there, but this is going to have an impact on us too, I'm sure. Katie Austin is our business correspondent who can speak to us now. A lot of market volatility, well, today over the last week, really, Katie. What's been going on and how long is this going to go on for, do you think?
Well, one really immediate impact was that after the US said that it was, alongside European allies, considering boycotting the supply of Russian oil, the price of a barrel of Brent crude, that's the global benchmark, soared to $139. Now, that's nearly a 14-year high. It has fallen back a bit since then, but another of the fresh records we've seen as the Ukraine crisis has progressed, and such a big impact because Russia is the world's second largest exporter of oil there. Gas prices, which were already very high, have spiked again today, and the UK wholesale gas price hit 800 pence a therm at one point. Now, if things stay at these kind of highs, that does eventually feed through to how much people and businesses are paying for their goods. Oil is used widely in manufacturing, and one thing that many drivers will have already noticed is the impact on how much they're paying for fuel at forecourts. We've already seen the average price for a litre of petrol in the UK hit £1.55 and diesel hit £1.61, and experts are saying, well, there's more to come as the impact of the high oil price feeds through. And another warning we've had today was the boss of one of the world's biggest fertiliser companies said the situation that's happening could lead to disruption to the supply and increases to the cost of food as well.
And that's coming after we've had problems with supply chains already for quite some time. And actually talking about the food there, that people are going to notice that, aren't they, in the supermarkets?
Yeah, we are seeing signs that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impact of sanctions is really going to hit home for a lot of people around the world. And we are seeing some of the nervousness about the wider economic impact in the markets today. European markets were down this morning. The FTSE 100 is down in London, but slightly less than other European markets. But still, this sense building up that, yes, the shockwaves, the economic impact really could be quite far-reaching and hit a lot of people.
OK, Katie Austin, then, our business unit. Thank you very much indeed. And Ian, you've alluded to this a couple of times already. I mean, how serious do you think this is? And more crucially, maybe, how prepared are governments in the West? And have they prepared us, do you think?
No, is the latter point. I think this is an event that is, unless the war stops quickly, which it seems highly unlikely, this is an event that's much bigger than the financial crisis. It's not often you get to see, US Secretary of State make such an epic geopolitical error in real time. But what Blinken did, and of course remember the Americans, having been sensible on energy policy, are effectively energy self-sufficient, which we're not in Europe. Germany's hooked on Russian gas, and Britain has its own particular set of problems, not that problem. What he did was the worst of all worlds. It suggested unhooking from Russian exports, which sent the price through the roof. It's now settled back down a bit, which only really helps Russia, ultimately. You either do it and take the hit, which means Germany coping somehow with about 30 to 40% less energy, and means a complete rethink of European energy policy, which needs to happen here as well, or you don't do it. One of the two. You don't say that you're thinking about doing it, and then also, if the Americans, to underline what a mess America is in, if they can't get the Saudis to do what they want, and they seem to be struggling to get the Israelis to do what they want as well, then what is the point of America as the leader of the free world? And I say that as an Atlanticist. So I think what is happening, unless the war is stopped in some way, and we'll get very lucky, is we are moving into a war era that is going to require a complete rethink on how we think about things like energy security and supply, and food security and supply. We should stay calm about it, but there should be a plan over the next year, 18 months, to prepare people. It's going to be really, really tough, but there isn't an alternative.
Raphael, do you share those concerns? Boris Johnson saying that nothing is off the table when it comes to sanctions on Russia that could obviously impact our economy here.
Well, yeah, I think just going back to something that was said earlier in terms of the sort of hope that somehow pressure is brought to bear on Vladimir Putin, whether it's by sort of oligarchs saying, actually, we don't really like what's happening to the economy here, or people around the Kremlin saying this isn't working, this war is a disaster for Russia, or less plausible still, an uprising of Russian people who don't like the war. There doesn't seem to be much sign of that. There's a bit of a race against time here. What you have to do ultimately is put enough of a chokehold on the Russian economy hard and fast enough that the impact there is so severe that it avoids the outcome that Ian was just talking about, that somehow things move in Russia fast enough that we don't then get into this economic war of attrition where suddenly a lot of the pain we're inflicting on Russia starts to seep back to us in terms of the energy prices, which we've discussed, but also Russia is one of the world's, if not the world's largest grain exporter. There are all sorts of ways in which these increased costs will feed into consumer inflation in this country. And we're already looking at a situation in the US and in the UK where central banks were looking at raising interest rates against that. Now, that is going to be problematic in terms of servicing debt. If that is going to happen, it's a difficult thing to do, as you say, in a war economy. So the longer this goes on, the harder it is to see actually where the balance of economic pain really lands. And it seems to me there's quite a big gamble being taken. I think it's the right one, by the way, because I think you do have to just try and the weapon you've got against Russia is the economic one. But you've got to hope that the sanctions and economic weaponry that is being applied against Russia is effective enough, quickly enough, because otherwise the damage really starts to just sort of spread and seep everywhere. And then we have no idea what the political ramifications are of that for Western democracies, for countries where people aren't used to living people didn't like austerity that much when it was post-financial crisis. They definitely aren't going to like what might be coming down the line, as Ian just sort of outlined for us.
And of course, this does all come at a time when there are tax rises on the cards. Let's have a listen to the Conservative MP, John Redwood, who was speaking to my colleague Caroline Quinn last night on the Westminster Hour.
The government does need to think again. I would urge it again to have a crisis meeting and work out what it can do to relieve the cost of living crisis. I think not just national insurance increase should go, but I think VAT should come off domestic fuel. I think VAT should come off all green goods because we want to promote people to save energy at home, and yet those things all have VAT as if we were still in the EU.
Well, there is a spring statement coming up quite soon. Laura, do you think that the Chancellor is likely to move on any of those things?
Well, I do think it depends how this conflict unfolds. And listening to both Ian and Raphael, I have to say that one of the things that makes this so difficult to assess is the asymmetry of the conflict. From Russia, it's military. From the West, it's an economic retaliation. And, your piece with Anthony Blinken covered the possibility of an energy blockade, which, yes, would strangle the Russian economy, but we don't know how that would be interpreted in terms of an escalation of hostilities. And we don't know what it would mean in the short term, we do know whether it would require a long-term adjustment in the West, and are we prepared for this? So, look, it is the case that the government has been dealing with rising energy prices really since the back end of last year, and mitigations have been put in place, like the energy rebate and a number of other things that were part of the last spending review. But yes, of course, it's a dynamic situation, and I would be expecting the Chancellor to be thinking about it very carefully leading up to the next spending review.
Do you think it's time for a U-turn on national insurance rise?
I think yes. I mean, loads of economists have said now is not the time to do that. And obviously the Labour Party's main concern is that whatever sanctions we take and all of this perfect storm of Brexit and lockdown and everything that's had a direct impact on the British food producers and all of the other, we've got to make sure that it doesn't hit the poorest hardest.
How do you do that?
I think that's a job for the Chancellor, and he's got to mitigate that in the budget, hasn't he? He's got to make sure that those who are really struggling have got some kind of relief in his budget. I don't know how. I'm glad I don't have to do that job.
Laura, it is your party is going to have to deal with this, and you must have constituents who are struggling already. And as we can see, that it's only going to get harder, isn't it?
Well, I mean, a sort of £20 billion pound package is in place already with the energy rebate. I do concede, of course, that predated the illegal invasion of Ukraine. So, as I said, it's sort of dynamic and shifting. But I think the focus has been for several months from the Treasury on supporting those on low and middle incomes with the cost of living, and I would expect that to continue.
But the national insurance rise, I mean, it's at the moment it is coming in and it's going to hit people on top of everything else. I agree with John Rubbard.
Well, John Rubbard is actually a sort of doughty champion on the cost of living, and actually we all sort of listen carefully to him in the House. I don't think the national insurance rise is going to be abandoned, but I don't think that prevents the government from looking carefully at the cost of living, and particularly energy, particularly in the context of what we've just been discussing.
And you think more help, particularly for those who need it most?
I can see that being their focus, yes.
Yeah, OK. Ian, is that the answer, do you think?
Possibly, but what's happening at the moment on energy anyway, and oil and gas, and then the tax receipts which come from the sales of that completely blows all the figures up in the air anyway. So the government's projections, it's now really the time to try and get £12 billion off very hard-pressed households. I'd suggest not. There's a discussion ongoing in government about energy policy and about whether they stick with what they've got. I'm baffled by the business and energy department's approach to this. They don't seem to really have clocked what's happening in the last 10 days, which is bizarre considering it's run by a historian. I mean, these are huge political and economic forces at work here, and we're not in COP26, Toto. I mean, the world is transforming in front of us, and government, and it can only really be the Prime Minister who does it, who essentially has the convening power to say, right, you need a wartime energy policy. Of course, long term, this is a perfect advert for the fact that you need to unhook from hydrocarbons, very long term. But in the next 2 years, you need to put everything back on the table, which will increase supply, which will also improve insulation, which will reduce energy use. It requires a national effort, because even if the war ends, we can't guarantee. There's not necessarily a nice happy ending where the person that succeeds Putin, if he falls, which is unlikely, is Mikhail Gorbachev part 2 or Mandela. It's unlikely to be that. It's likely to be someone from the existing circle and elite. So we have to plan the next 5 to 10 years on the basis that defending Eastern Europe is the priority and securing our energy supply is our domestic priority.
I don't disagree with what Ian's saying, but I don't perhaps accept the criticism that the government's supine on this. I mean, they're working with the International Energy Agency all the time on, I think they've just released another 60 million barrels of oil onto the international market. We have about 3 months' supply of our own reserves. We talk constantly about nuclear, Sizewell C, and then also the smaller units. I know that's a longer-term objective, but I think that a dynamic approach in government to energy is something that you see, and it is debated in normal time as well as in the context of the energy crisis we're looking at now.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, the 3-month supply sounds pretty scary, doesn't it, in the sort of context that we're talking about now. And, we do have to learn to be more self-sufficient. And you would think that with Brexit coming down the line for kind of 5-6 years, we'd have thought about that, because that was one of the kind of slogans, wasn't it, that we don't need to be part of the biggest trading bloc in the world. So, where are these plan Bs? What's going on?
Well, let's talk about Britain's place in the world. It seems like a long time ago, but the days before Russia invaded Ukraine, we were talking about the real possibility of Boris Johnson being challenged for the leadership. The BBC's political editor, Laura Koonsberg, has done an analysis over the weekend of how this has changed the political dynamic, really, if you like, saying that the Ukraine war has put the brakes on efforts to remove Boris Johnson, for now at least. Raphael, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, we're right in at the moment in the first sort of flash of a very extreme international situation. It would just be sort of downright peculiar, as much as anything else, for the Conservative Party itself to say, let's just remove the Prime Minister, when the original grievance, as it were, was something very domestic and related to something that now already feels quite remote in the past, even though it was just last year, the pandemic. Unfortunately, though, the actual problem that I think a lot of Conservative MPs have with the Prime Minister, not to mention the fact that he's lost a lot of popularity in the country, comes down to something much more fundamental, which is whether he is actually really up to the job in hand, whether he, first of all, can be relied upon to tell the truth. That was a big issue in terms of what was said around all the parties in Downing Street, whether he's basically a dishonest person. And a lot of Conservative MPs have been saying that about him for quite a long time. And whether he has any kind of real capacity for administrative grip. He allowed Downing Street to get a bit out of control. He's essentially the proposition that he presents, as a candidate to be Prime Minister, which seemed like such a great idea in 2019 to sort of win a vague argument about getting Brexit done, has seemed less and less credible the more and more serious the situation has become. Now we are in the most extremely serious situation. And I just can't help thinking that ultimately those sort of inadequacies of character are going to, that he's not going to change. And so they might find new ways to express themselves just through the current situation. So ultimately, yes, clearly he's got a kind of a reprieve because there's a war on. But is he any better a human being at doing the job of Prime Minister in an extreme situation now than he was a month ago? Probably not. So it'll be, all I can say is it'll be very interesting to see how that then plays out in the coming months.
Laura, I spoke to lots of your colleagues who were very unhappy with Boris Johnson. Do you think, firstly, is he up to the job? And this is now a huge challenge for him and other world leaders, isn't it? And has that anger amongst your colleagues dissipated?
Well, I think we're in the most sort of serious global, this is the most serious global moment for global politics since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think the country is looking for leadership. My read on it is that the Parliamentary Party is right behind him, and I think one of the things, and I know his critics will be resistant to this, but I do think he's shown real leadership over Ukraine. We were one of the first countries actually with the intelligence that suggested to us strongly that Putin was going to invade. And there were a lot that were saying that he was doing it because he wanted to redraw the security architecture in the Eastern Bloc and that this was all manoeuvring. And we were saying otherwise. And as a result of that, we were one of the first to get defensive military aid to Ukraine before the conflict broke out. And we've seen that kind of leadership going through. So, yes, I think he has the support of the party.
Well, we've seen Boris Johnson this morning. He's been hosting the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. They are here with him today. So, he's already been to Estonia. He's been on the phone to lots of other world leaders. This is him, he would say, showing leadership. Is that the case, do you think? Is Britain now in a position to be a global leader?
I think it's absolutely the case that in the last couple of months, British intelligence has sort of led the way with the Americans and the EU. It's not a competition, but I've heard people in the EU acknowledge this. The UK and the US did try to warn the EU, who didn't believe it, but the EU has since responded brilliantly. I think we're seeing the world remade again, actually. I think it's a European moment, and I think the Global Britain slogan, I understand the point of it, and I'm sure that he'll still try and advocate closer links with Australia and New Zealand. But what's happening in European politics is extraordinary. I haven't seen anything like it since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the notion of defending Europe now really becomes the priority. And that's complex because we're not in the EU, but also Sweden's not in NATO. The security structures overlap, but the priority is going to be defending Europe, because the key salient fact, and sorry, this is not great news, but the front runner, it's clear, you look at the American polls, for the US presidency is Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not reliable on NATO and not necessarily reliable on dealing with Putin either. So I think this is going to require a big shift on the part of Brexiteers and Remainers, is that actually we're not just a third country when it comes to the European Union. We obviously have a special relationship and interest as part of the European family, and that's going to have to manifest itself in defence, intelligence, security cooperation.
And Rosie, that's the point, isn't it? That this is about, if you're in the EU or you're not in the EU and NATO, you've all got to work together, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Parliament has to be united right at the moment over this crisis. We can't be involved in sort of petty squabbles about leadership. And it's good to hear that the Conservatives are parking that for now. But those charges against Boris Johnson haven't gone away, and nor has Partygate, and it will come back to haunt him when the time is right.
Raphael?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something Ian said. I agree broadly, that no one now wants to sort of relitigate Brexit. It's done, and politically, that we now sort of accommodate to the new reality. I do think it is a bit of a shame in that context that, well, first of all, there was a long period where British politics was conditioned by, they said, quite a facile view of what the European project was, that there's a sort of belittling of the idea that the European Union was actually a strategic alliance as well as a trading bloc. And now clearly we now understand that obviously it's a strategic alliance. That it was when EU and NATO took in former Soviet satellite countries, former Soviet republics in the Baltic, for example. That was a package because those countries and the people who wanted to be in those institutions understood that it was part of an integrated security partnership. And it was a bit of a shame, ultimately, that, you've got to stop me there.
There's quite a lot to talk about. That's all we have time for today. Thank you to all my guests, and we'll be back tomorrow at 12:15 with more on Politics Live.